everybody. Good to see you guys today, and excited that we have the opportunity to be together. Always such an encouragement for us to gather. And before we dive into the message today, I want to say a special hello to all of you who are our guests today with us for the first time. Maybe you're back for the first time in a bit. We just want to say welcome home. It's great to have you. My name's Pat. I'm the campus pastor here, and it is a joy to see you today as well as everybody else that calls this place home on a regular basis. I echo what Tony said just a few moments ago. It is just encouraging to see your faces. I know the week can make us a little weary as we live our lives during the week, and I just think there's something very powerful and very palatable, right, about us being together. I think it's such an encouraging thing, and so I'm so glad that you made the decision to be here today. And for me to see your lovely, beautiful faces always makes me smile a little more. So excited to see you today and where we're going. This is actually going to... next week, we'll do like a standalone message, and then we're going to jump back into the book of Daniel. Today, we'll kind of close out this version or perspective of the series, but we're going to continue on in the book of Daniel in 2 weeks after our baptism Sunday, and so we're going to shut down Locked Up Abroad today. And so if this is your first time to be here for this series, or maybe you're like, well, not other people, but you might have forgotten a little bit about what we've talked about. This series, Locked Up Abroad, is based on a television show that's been around for 15 seasons on the National Geographic Channel, and it follows the stories of real people who go out of the country and they go to a foreign country, and due to some crazy, wild circumstance, they find themselves in prison in a foreign land. Now, I can't think of a scarier prospect than that, right? To be locked up in a foreign place where you don't know the language, you don't have any contacts. You're subject to their interpretation of their laws. You don't even know their laws, but you're there and you're locked up. And I know this, if as I watch that show, if I was experiencing that in person, I would feel two things. I would feel lots of things, but two things for sure. I would feel like I was powerless, and there's nothing I could do about where I was. And when you feel powerless and there's nothing you can do about where you are, hope kind of runs away, right? Doesn't feel like there's any light in the midst of the darkness, and it can be very overwhelming. And so we've kind of been riffing off of that idea that the show presents, that you feel powerless, there's nothing you can do about it, and you just feel like, man, you can't get out. And so we're talking about in this series how to overcome hardships, and we're hopefully learning some things and picking up some important principles that we learned from the life of Daniel as we walk through this, of how we can meander through, right, or navigate through the difficulties that life throws at us, because you guys have lived long enough to know this, and you don't have to live very long to understand. Life can be hard sometimes, can it? It can be very difficult sometimes, and the things that are so unexpected, we can't control our circumstances quite often, and so life can throw us some curveballs for sure, and we feel like sometimes we're powerless and there's nothing we can do about where we are. And so as we've been studying the life of Daniel, he was a part of a people that were literally taken from their land and taken to a foreign place, and basically Daniel lived there his whole life. Right, he really never really got back, and it was a crazy situation. And some things we've learned from Daniel, and probably the most important thing that I've said every week, and I will say it again several times today in a few different ways. The most important decision that we can make when we feel powerless, when we feel like there's no way out, when we feel like we're overwhelmed, we feel like we're locked up abroad. Right, one of the most important things we can resolve to do, the first and most important thing is, you know what? No matter what life throws at me, I'm going to choose to honor God where I am. I'm going to choose to honor Him and to trust Him. Even when I feel like I'm at a disadvantage, even when life is overwhelming me, I'm going to make the decision to trust God where I am. There's lots of things you can't do, right? You can't control your circumstance. You can't control what other people do that sometimes bring difficult circumstances upon you. But we've been saying this. The one thing you can always control is how you respond and what you decide to do. And so you can control you, and why not make the most wise decision you can that begins with honoring God where you are. And so wherever you find yourself today, I would just like to say this. The most important decision that you have to make, it's the next decision that you're going to make. That's the most important decision. You can't do anything about yesterday. You don't know what tomorrow holds. But one thing you can do is control what you do right here and right now. And why not make the best decision to make your next one a godly decision where you honor Jesus? And Daniel shows us, I think, in this book, the book of Daniel does many things, but one thing I think it does well is it shows us the importance of how one godly decision can change everything. It can change everything. It can bring hope when you feel hopeless. And so today, I want to close today with this point. Not that I'm closing the message right now. Some of you are like, yep, this could be a good day. 3.5-minute sermon, we out. I love this church. I hate to disappoint you. I want to begin with a point I'm going to close with in a little bit, right? So you're not getting off the hook that easy. Overcoming hardship. This is going to kind of create the frame of the front and the back that we're going to kind of paint in today. Overcoming hardship ultimately begins by me being faithful to God. Like, this is key. I talked about just up at the beginning even, right? That the most important decision we have to make is the next one. We must choose to honor God. To be faithful to Him is the most important thing. And so we just want to challenge you and remind you over and over again, as life gets difficult, and it will, honor God with your life. And we've said this, we've seen it in the life of Daniel, that when you honor God, God honors you. He does. Now, that doesn't mean all your wildest dreams are going to come true, because when Daniel decided to honor God, he didn't get to go back home, did he? No, he was still locked up abroad. But in the midst of the darkness, he experienced the light of God because he chose to honor God. And when you honor God, here's what I think it does to our lives. It makes us really aware that God is with us, that He's always been with us, and He's already been doing work in the difficult circumstance that we haven't seen because our eyes have been blinded because we've been overwhelmed with the difficulty. But when we choose to honor Him and trust Him, I think it opens our eyes where we are more aware that He is right beside us. And if we can come to the place where we understand and know that no matter what's going on in my life, God is with me. If He is with me, everything I'm going to need, I already have right beside me. Right? Because He's with me. And when you honor Him, it opens our eyes to have the perspective that God is with us even in the difficult moments. And when we draw close to Him, we understand this about the presence of God. In the presence of God is fullness of joy. In the presence of God is the fullness of hope and life and grace and strength and courage and encouragement. Everything we need, we already possess. We just need to be aware of it. And I think one of the things that takes the blinders off of us most quickly is the decision to honor Him where we are. We see Him in new ways, and He invites us to come near to Him. Daniel honored God, but he wasn't released from his captivity, but he experienced freedom in his captivity because he made a wise decision to honor and trust God where He is. And part of honoring and trusting God is not just realizing He is there, but it's also taking that step of faith to invite others into the journey with you. One of the greatest provisions God gives us in the midst of difficult circumstance is the community we are surrounded by. One of the greatest things we can do to find life in the midst of difficult circumstances is to not walk through it alone. We need each other desperately. And God shows Himself mightily often through His people that are around us. And so we must invite others into the journey. It absolutely matters. So in the midst of difficult circumstances, we said this in the second week, that you got to call on others to come and pray with you. You will not make it through on your own. We need each other. Yes and amen. We need each other. And call on others to pray with you as you walk through the difficult parts of life. And then as we learned in the third week, we looked at the story of the fiery furnace and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? We learned a very powerful story about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And ultimately we learned that God is already in the fire. He's always been there. He's already working. But I pointed out something that I want to remind you of today that's very critical. King Nebuchadnezzar, after having a dream that the statue that was in his dream that represented his empire was going to crumble, Nebuchadnezzar comes out of that dream after it's interpreted and says, hey, I'm going to double down and I'm going to build a statue in real life. And the statue is going to be gigantic, and it's going to be strong, and it will stand forever. And this will show that God that says my empire is going to come down. This will show him that Babylon is mighty. And so he builds this statue 90 feet high, 9 feet thick, covered in gold, right? And huge, huge statue, can you imagine? And he says, when the band strikes up, everybody in the land will bow down and worship mighty Babylon. So everybody bows down except for 3 dudes who I think are impacted and influenced by Daniel's decision in chapter 1 to honor God, even if it puts you at a disadvantage. And so these 3 guys decide to not bow down. And I made this point, and I think it's important for us to understand that their worship of God, by refusing to worship the statue and bow down, their worship and faith in God, it was resistance to the empire that they were in. In other words, when the culture of the empire that they were in tried to pull them away from trusting God, when they put their foot down and they resolved to worship God no matter what happened to them, right? It was resistance to the empire and the culture that was trying to pull them away. Their worship was resistance, right? And so we must understand that our acts of worship, what does it mean to worship God? Is it about singing? It's a part of it, of course, but saying things and singing things is not the totality or the wholeness of worshiping God. It's how we honor him in every area of our life. That's what it is to truly worship God. And when we truly worship God in every area of our life, it is resistance to the empire that we live in. It is. We've all agreed to this throughout this series, that America, are we a superpower? Okay, yes, we are a superpower, not a trick question there. And being a superpower, there's a culture that surrounds superpower. There is a way that superpowers go about trying to achieve peace in the world. And this is the example I've given most every week, right? The culture of empire or superpower says to do what to your enemies to achieve peace? You know the answer. Hate them, kill them, eliminate them to achieve peace. And that goes in direct opposition to the kingdom of God perfectly revealed in Jesus, who tells us not to hate or eliminate our enemies, but to do what? To love them. To love them, to serve them, right? Even our enemies. And so when we choose to worship and follow the way of Jesus, even when it's difficult, even when it's costly, right? Our worship is resistance to the empire or superpower, the culture that tries to pull us away from truly trusting the way of Jesus. And so I want you to look at your worship as not just something you do on a Sunday, but how you live your life. And when you live your life in the way of the kingdom of God, it resists the culture around us that tries to pull us in certain directions and deceive us that there's a better way to change this world other than self-giving, co-suffering, radically forgiving love, right? And our worship always pulls us back to that reality that we will change the world as Jesus did through love and giving and serving. Yes, yes, and amen, right? Our worship is resistance to the culture around us. And as we trust him, right, we become aware of something very powerful. And this is when our faith is, man, it's big. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they truly worshiped God and refused to bow down to anything else, they became aware of a reality that we need to become aware of. That even when they were thrown in the fire, God was with them. And if God is with them, he is able to deliver them. And here's what we encourage you to know. God is with you in the fire. God is with you in the difficult moments. God is with you when relationships are crumbling around you. He's there. And even when you don't perceive him or sense him, here's how good God is. He's already working. And when we choose to trust him and honor him, kind of become aware of what he's doing. And this is when we grow to have the faith that, Lord, even if I'm in the fire, you're able to deliver me. But even if you choose not to, and I've got to walk through this fire and come out the other side, I know this, that if I have to walk through it, you're going to walk through with me. And if you're with me, I'll need nothing. Right? This is what worship and trust in following the way of Jesus does. And I say it often, to get to this point is difficult. To truly follow the way of Jesus, it is hard, isn't it? It's hard to love your enemies, isn't it? It's difficult. But ultimately, it's worth it because it gives us life and hope and peace. And not just to us, but the potential in the lives of other people. And so we've learned so much, or at least I hope you've learned so much throughout this series. I hope it's been enlightening. I hope that you have thought differently about the world that we live in. I hope you have a new perspective, and I hope it's been a little transformational as well as we live our lives in the age like Daniel and the Israelites, in the age of empires and superpowers. Like there is a culture we must resist to truly follow the way of Jesus. And as Daniel and his three compadres chose to just simply honor God where they were, it had tremendous impact. And here's what's wild. Not only did it impact them and the people around them, ultimately it impacted the king of the most powerful empire in the world. And who was that king? Anybody remember? It rhymes with Nebuchadnezzar. Anybody? There you go. Nebuchadnezzar. That's okay. King Nebuchadnezzar ultimately came to a point in his life where he chose to honor God. But it didn't start that way. It took someone setting the example, making the decision. And even the heart of a king of an empire made a great change. But before that, King Nebuchadnezzar, as we learned in 605 BC, besieged Jerusalem, took people captive, not only people, but he took articles from the temple that Solomon built. He took them back to Babylon. We're going to see today why using those articles from the temple in an incorrect way is a big no-no. We'll get there in just a minute. But King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, they were a dominant force. There was no equal. They had conquered Egypt and everybody else along the way. And there was no one that rivaled the Babylonian Empire. It was the most dominant and beautiful city in the world. It reached a population of over 2 million people. It was filled with temples and terraces and palaces. I mean, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, right? One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Like this was a big-time empire, right? Guarded by double and triple walls, 300 feet high. Right? This was a big city, and the city was so great, and Nebuchadnezzar had built this great city. Well, he abused and oppressed people to build his great city. Let's put it like it is. But he was in charge and the leader of this great city, and he was so full of himself, he had his initials printed on every brick in every building and every wall all around the empire. You want to talk about a baller move, right? That's it right there, right? Your initials in every brick around. Like his ego was huge. It was a sophisticated world leader, right? I don't know if this is a blessing or a curse, but in Babylon, they discovered quadratic equations and reciprocals and square roots. That's math. I say it's a curse, but for some, that's a blessing. My wife's not here. She's a math teacher, so I can say those things today. But like their discoveries are impacting us today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. Babylonians come up with that. 360 degrees in a circle, the Babylonian Empire, right? Credits, bills, promissory notes, like all of that, right? Credited in some way to the Babylonian Empire. So this was a great empire that brought much to the world, and you can kind of see how Nebuchadnezzar could step back and take a look at this and think, my, look at what I have done. And he gets full of himself, and his pride swells. But here's what I know. When you get full of yourself, and you get a lot of pride in your life, not the good kind of pride, but the look at me and how great I am kind of pride that causes us to push God away and put ourselves at the center. When we're filled with that kind of pride, things can begin to turn because we begin to neglect and we stop doing the things that we used to do that brought us to that place, right? Proverbs warns us of this, that pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. And so we must be very careful to be a humble people because every blessing we don't turn into praise has the potential to turn into pride. Why do I say that? It is very easy to become centered on ourselves, isn't it? So easy. And we must be very careful to be a people who walk in humility. Pride is dangerous because it opens the door and can invite into our lives all kinds of things that can make us unhealthy, right? Whether it be habits, or pride leads us down a path that we thought would give us life, but ultimately it takes it from us, or we get so full of ourselves and so filled up with who we are and what we're doing that we begin to neglect the very people and relationships that God has placed into our lives. Pride can lead to compromise, where we begin to think, I've built this, I deserve it. Even if it's unhealthy, I'm going to do this thing because I think it's ultimately good for me, right? Pride leads us to compromise, and ultimately we take the place of God in our lives, take matters into our own hands, and try to control everything, but not just everything. We try to control everybody. And here's what I know. When you begin to do that, and you become prideful and try to control everybody, your circle gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and your relationships and ultimately life is set up for a great fall. This is what happened in the life of King Nebuchadnezzar, right? In Daniel chapter 4, which was last week we talked about Daniel chapter 4. And oddly enough, Daniel chapter 4 is King Nebuchadnezzar recounting what happened in his life. And he tells the negative side of what brought him and ultimately the positive that came out of the hardship that he walked through, right? And Daniel told King Nebuchadnezzar he had had another dream and he was worried about it. And Daniel, of course, interprets the dream and basically says, King, unless you turn from your pride, your empire is going to crumble. It's going to fall. But he couldn't turn from his pride. And he said, look at my palace. Look at what I have done. This is for the glory of me. And at that moment, he lost all his royal authority, and he was driven from his kingdom for a period of 7 years, lived outdoors for 7 years. Like, that's my biggest nightmare, to live outside, right? And so he does. And he eats grass with cattle and basically is driven mad, right, for a period of 7 years. And ultimately, he says, you know, maybe I should humble myself before God, right? And he does. And listen to the end of Daniel chapter 4. This is King Nebuchadnezzar talking. Babylonian pagan king. Listen to what he says. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he would know this, he is able to humble. But he calls it good. He's been humbled because ultimately it brings him back into a reconciled relationship with God. And he humbles himself before God. And Babylon's prosperity returns. And ultimately in 562 BC, at the ripe old age of 104 years old, that's a long time, King Nebuchadnezzar passes away. But he dies ultimately at peace with God. Now, before we turn the page into chapter 5 for today, I just want you to take that statement I just said. At 104 years old, he dies humbled before the Lord and at peace with God. And I want you to go back to Daniel chapter 1. After Jerusalem has been besieged, he has no respect for God whatsoever, robs from the temple, and now all of a sudden at the end of his life, he is praising God and honoring and adoring God. What brought that about? I want to say again, one godly decision, a choice to honor God in the midst of a difficult circumstance, can have impact for generations to come. Don't think too little of the decisions that you have to make, because they matter. And to choose to honor God with the next decision you have to make could make such a difference, not just in you, but through you out into the people that are around you. And so Nebuchadnezzar dies, which means that another king is going to take his place. But as another king rises to take his place, this king does not revere God whatsoever, didn't listen to Nebuchadnezzar, and Babylon continues in pride, continues in paganism. And as we turn the page to Daniel chapter 5, we find ourselves on October the 12th in 539 BC. Like, what's today, October 24th? Is that right? Yeah, so like 12 days earlier, however many thousands of years ago, like, this is the time of year that these things are happening. In 539 BC, 23 years after Nebuchadnezzar had passed away, several kings have risen and fallen, right? There's been power struggles, assassinations, and ultimately we find the golden age of Babylon is done. But it's still a large, walled, fortified city. And it has a new king, and his name is Belshazzar. And there's one thing about Belshazzar as a king. Belshazzar loved one thing. Belshazzar loved a good party. Loved a good party. And let's go to Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. And this is such an interesting story. It says, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. Now, that sounds innocent enough, but what you might not realize, and they definitely realized and knew this, and this was what makes it strange. The knowledge they had that they chose to party like this is crazy to me. They should not have thrown a party this night. They should have been watching, because there are detailed historical records that tell us on October the 10th, 2 days before what we're talking about, the armies of the Medes and the Persians arrive around the city of Babylon. And so what are they doing when their enemies are coming to take over their city? They're throwing a party, right? Because we're a great big Babylon. Let me tell you what pride can do. Pride has a way of causing us to ignore the reality of what's really happening in front of us. It does. It causes us to look at our marriages and relationships and say, oh, everything's just fine. But really, things are crumbling. Pride has a way of causing us to ignore the reality of what's going on right in front of us. They had 300-foot high walls, double walls, right? They were so advanced, they had kind of diverted the Euphrates River to go through the middle of the city and then create a moat around their city, right? And they thought they had it all. And so they throw a party. They had food and water and walls, supplies for months, but unfortunately, they also had an abundance of pride that was causing them to ignore the reality of what was really taking place in real life around them. And so in verse 2 it says, when Belshazzar was drinking his wine, this is when things get crazy. He gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father's just another way to say his predecessor, that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. And so that the king and his nobles, his wives and concubines, might drink wine and party with the temple articles. Right? So they take the goblets of silver and gold from the temple, which are sacred, and they party with them. What a better way to show everybody you ain't scared. Right? What a better way to show that the Babylonian gods are better than the God of the Hebrews than to take what is sacred and desecrate it. And when a great army surrounds your city to take it down, you incapacitate yourselves with a party. Right? And this is what they do. In verse 3 it says, so they brought in the gold goblets that they had taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the kings, his nobles, wives, and concubines drank from them. And as they drank the wine, this is so important, and I hope this sets off some alerts in you. If not, I will remind you. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And I see the perplexed looks on your faces, so I'll take you back. Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of a great statue. And the head of the statue was made of gold, and it represented King Nebuchadnezzar. Then as you go down the body, there were arms of silver and chest of bronze and legs of iron. And as you go down the statue, right, and then ultimately the foundation was baked clay and iron together, right? And that just means this: when something hits something that's fragile, clay, pottery, it's going to shatter and fall. And so what we're about to see the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 2. The Babylonian Empire is about to fall, and it's so interesting to me that in this moment they praise the gods of gold and silver and bronze, and that's the very thing that the statue is made up of that gets weaker and weaker and weaker as each king takes its place, that weakens the Babylonian strength. Right? And so this is about to be fulfilled right in front of us, right? And so the Babylonian Empire is going to fall. And so they begin to praise the gods of gold, iron, stone, and all of those things. And it's an act of defiance, a straight act of defiance against the one true God. And then a most peculiar thing happens in the middle of their partying and revelry and all of these incredible things. DJ's got it going, right? And it's incredible. It's a big party. And something happens that would only be described, I mean, it's Halloween time. Like, what happens next would be in a horror movie. and it terrifies everybody that's at this party, right? All of a sudden, in the middle of this pride-filled party, the music and the DJ and the dancing and the drinking comes to a screeching halt, right? You've all seen that movie scene where everybody's partying and the record scratches, and everything stops. That's what happens here. And then a horror movie takes place. Verse 5, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appear. That's scary. Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appear and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. And the king watched as the hand wrote. And his face turned pale, and he was so frightened his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. Yes, they did. For me, this would have been like diaper changes. Like, it's so scary. And he calls immediately for all the enchanters and magicians and fortune teller. Tell me what it means, but no one can tell him. And then the queen says, oh, I remember a guy named Daniel, right? His God's spirit is in him. That's what she says, right? And so women just seem to have the wisest answers at the craziest time, don't they? Yeah. All right? Giving you a shout out, ladies. So let's get Daniel. Daniel arrives at the party where no one is partying, and he offers the king, or the king offers Daniel, rather, great rewards, a new promotion, but Daniel's not interested because he knows the king's words carry no weight. And so you got to think about this. Daniel's old now. He arrived in Babylon in 605 BC. This is 539 BC. That means he's been living there for 66 years and probably a teenager when he got taken there. So he's an old man. And when he addresses the king, he doesn't say, "O king, live forever." There are no niceties. He's just straight to the point. It's what happens when you get older, right? You just get off my lawn. That's just what you say. And that's what Daniel does. There's no niceties. There's no kindness. He's direct and straight to the point. And then he recounts the story in chapter 5, 18 through 24 of chapter 4 of what happened in Nebuchadnezzar. And he said, hey, king, Nebuchadnezzar had it all. He was filled with pride. He almost lost it. But he humbled himself and he found life and peace with God. And listen what he says in verse 22. He says, but you, his successor, O Belshazzar, you have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. Right? He knew these stories. He knew the right thing to do, but he didn't take the responsibility to put it into practice. Here's something else that pride does. Pride prevents us from applying life-giving knowledge. It causes us to ignore responsibility and do the right thing, right? The more you know, the more responsibility you have to put it into practice. If you have knowledge that will save people, it is irresponsible to not put that into practice, right? The king has knowledge of all of these things, and he leads a great city, but he refuses to take that responsibility. Instead, verse 23, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles and all the party people drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which cannot see, hear, or understand. You put your trust in something that's not even alive. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. And therefore he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. And this is the inscription that was written that no one could interpret. Mene, mene, tekel parsin. Mic drop. Mene, mene, tekel parsin. And you're wondering, what do these words mean, Pat? I'll tell you, or Daniel will let us know. This is what these words mean, verse 26. Mene means this: God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. How many times does he say mene? Twice, right? To double the emphasis, right? Like for me, when I say, I really like Alice. Alice is my wife, by the way. I really like Alice. No. I really, really like Alice. Like you feel the emphasis and the punch there, right? And then verse 27, tekel. You've been weighed on the scales and found wanting. In other words, you're lacking. What is the king lacking in? Responsibility. Leading well. Putting into practice what he knew. He lacked in humility. He lacked in sanctity. He took what was sacred and desecrated it for his own purpose as opposed to the purpose of his people, holding it sacred. And then he lacked in fidelity, faithfulness towards God and towards the people that he led. And we know, what are the greatest things we can do in life? Love God and love people, right? Just be faithful to God and faithful to people, and you've done the whole of the law. But this king had done none of it. He was found lacking. And then verse 28, Perez, your king is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And Daniel tells it to the king just like it was. The fulfillment of that statue in the king's dream in chapter 2 was coming to a head. And just like that, like chaff on the threshing room floor in the summer, like we learned in chapter 2, it was all blown away with the wind, and Babylon was no more. Just like that, compromise after compromise after compromise weakened the foundation to the point where it just crumbled and blew away. How do we know it was compromise? Here's how we know. When pagan worship was introduced into things that are sacred to God, this is when things ultimately fail. That's compromise, right? One compromise easily leads into the next compromise, weakens the foundation of who we are, and causes us to believe and follow lies. And it weakens our foundation to the point where just the smallest thing can cause us to fall. And here's what I know. In difficult times and in hardships, isn't that when we're most prone to compromise? When we're grasping at anything to find life. This is why I've been saying over and over, the most important thing you can decide to do in the midst of a hardship is resolve to honor God where you are. Period. And that's why I think that overcoming hardship begins by being faithful to God, honoring him. What does it look like to honor God? Honoring God is about taking responsibility. Responsibility for what you know is right to do and then doing it. That's being responsible. Honoring God is about walking in humility, not letting your pride control you or you try to control others. You trust God instead. And then lastly, honoring God is about honoring what is sacred. That means this, doing right by God and doing right by others. That's what righteousness means, right? That's what to do right by people. You want to honor God? Love the people around you well, is what Jesus would say. This is what it is to honor him. And if we want to overcome, it begins by just making a decision. As I opened with, teased you I was closing with, but now in reality I am closing. Ultimately, overcoming hardship is about being faithful to God. Right here, right now. You can't do anything about last night or last week. You can't do anything about tomorrow. You don't know what's going to happen. But we all hold today in our hands. And what will we do with what we have? And my challenge is to honor him. And that requires a surrender of yourself to him alone.